right, lots of great things happening in high-speed rail, as you can see. We just want more of it to happen in this country. All right, our next speaker is Scott Sherin. He's Vice President of Marketing and Strategy for Alstom, North America. He has more than 15 years experience in the transportation industry, working in both passenger rail and freight customers in North America, China, and Europe. He's been with Alstom for the past 7 years, serving as Vice President, was responsible for strategy, marketing, and industry relations, and has also been a longtime member and a supporter of the association. And we do want to thank you, Scott, and Alstom for your ongoing support. It was pretty much Siemens and Alstom that has basically helped carry a lot of this forward to get us to where we are today. So with that, please welcome Scott.
Well, good morning, everyone. Armin gave you a bit of a view of projects going on around the world, which is good because I'm not going to do that. They wanted to discuss more. Can you guys hear me okay? Wanted to give you more of what are train builders and operators seeing around the world today, and how are we rethinking the business of high-speed rail. So first, there's a birthday this month. It was 40 years ago in March that the first 2 high-speed trains were introduced in France. So wanted to acknowledge that. If you look at Alstom and you look at our experience around the world, we've delivered almost 1,500 high-speed trains in more than 20 countries for 40 years. We've also been maintaining those trains for the past 20 years as well. The key things that we're seeing that are really changing is it's not about speed anymore. It used to be everybody would talk about how fast can the trains go, are you really high speed or not? You know, all aboard Florida is a very good example, but the speed's not important. It's really about reducing the journey time and the amount of time it takes to cover physical distance. There's then a talk in the US about higher speed, you know, up to 125 miles per hour, which is really a uniquely US definition. Most of the world looks at high speed up to 186 miles per hour, which is really 300 kilometers per hour, which is why the cutoff's there. And then very high speed, which is everything faster than that. But what the industry has realized is that the cost to maintain tracks to go any faster than that just doesn't make sense. It's cost prohibitive. You hear discussions all the time about state of good repair, how bridges are falling apart, how tunnels are falling apart, how roads are falling apart. The real question has become the business case. And how can rail operators optimize their return on investment and show actually profitable operations? If you look at Amtrak on the Northeast Corridor today, the reason why they were granted a RIF loan by US DOT is because the Acela service generates about $450 million a year in profit. Not revenue, profit. There was no better investment that Amtrak could make. There was no better investment that the US Department of Transportation with their loan program could make than to lend that money to Amtrak. It took a really long time for that to happen. Amtrak had to go through, I think, 3 different business cases that were all independently reviewed. At one point, it was reviewed twice by 2 different public accounting firms because DOT didn't believe the numbers. But there's really been this shift, again, away from speed back to profitable business cases. So when we look at California and when we look at the project itself, there's a lot of talk about the job creation. Great. There's a lot of talk about the environment. Great. There's a lot of talk about reduced journey time. All these things are great. The thing that's not, at least I'm not hearing enough, and I'm based on the East Coast, so maybe you see it more, but if I'm not seeing it on the East Coast, it's still not being said loudly enough. There needs to be more talk about how it can be a profitable operation. Not including the CapEx, but on the operation. Because whether you're a Democrat or you're a Republican or you like high-speed rail or you don't like high-speed rail, everybody gets, if you have a profitable business operation, there's a way to get behind it. So that's the first message that I want to leave with you from what we've been learning from other operators around the world. The other thing we've been learning is that to get to that profitability, there's both a cost side and a revenue side. And on the cost side, what has been happening is there's been a greater and greater shift to outsourcing of maintenance. Today, when we sell new high-speed trains, pretty much to any operator around the world, and sure, it's very similar for Siemens, it's the same for Bombardier, Chinese are trying to do it. Services are being bundled with the train sets because it's not about initial acquisition cost anymore, it's about total life cycle cost. These are assets that are being used for 20, 30, sometimes 40 years, and the cost of maintaining the trains over that period of time is typically a 1-to-1 ratio with the initial acquisition cost of the trains. So I'll throw out a number. If you're going to spend $1 billion on high-speed trains, you're going to spend $1 billion to maintain them. So you better make sure you're maintaining them as efficiently as possible, and you better make sure that you're bringing in the revenue. There's all sorts of ways to ensure that maintainability and that life cycle cost is being, at the lowest level. Some of the innovations that we're seeing in high speed today on the technology side are really coming around energy efficiency. And whether it's lighter weight materials or even the use of better data, we hear a lot of talk about big data. Well, one of the things that operators are starting to do around the world in partnership with the train set manufacturers is really being able, with data, to segment very precisely how energy is being consumed by different components on the train. It's no longer this discussion of, well, I need a lighter train or I need better aerodynamics. We're actually starting to look at, and you can see here, the consumption at a subsystem level and how that's affecting it to be able to reduce the cost. So then the second piece, thank you, Steve. So then the second part, after you get beyond the cost side of the return on investment, is really the passenger experience. Again, we were a little slow in the rail industry, as we are in a lot of things and coming around to this point, but we've now become laser focused on the passenger. And the question that we as train builders are asking ourselves, the question that operators all around the world are asking themselves is, how do you create a private experience through public mass transportation? And I would argue the answer to that question is what's going to drive the success of the industry. Phil Washington was here earlier and talking about, the biggest contributor to declining ridership has been people buying cars. Well, yes, people buy cars because it helps connect them potentially more easily to places they need to go where public transportation doesn't connect them. But we also drive our cars because they're comfortable spaces for ourselves. Right? We have our things where we want them. We can listen to what we want to listen to. We, can buy a car in whatever flavor we like that reflects our personality. It's part of us to some extent, and you can't get that with mass transportation traditionally. What you can get with mass transportation, though, and you particularly see it with the millennials, and I'd say it doesn't even apply to the millennials anymore. Everybody wants to be connected. Right? They want to be on their laptop talking with friends or doing work. They want to be on their phone or their other devices doing the same thing. You can't do that in a car today. The reason for the push with autonomous vehicles, the reason why Google is involved, the reason why Apple is involved, the reason why you have non-traditional actors in transportation today in these sectors is because if you can get to autonomous vehicles, you can have people using their apps and using their devices more often. And that's market share for them. Market share for them is time. And the more time people can be on their devices, the more market share they have. The one advantage that we have today with mass transportation and high-speed rail in particular, and it even applies if you look at a plane. And if you're getting on a plane, you can't use your device until you get to 10,000 feet. You can't use it when you're below 10,000 feet. Wi-Fi is spotty today. The one thing today about high-speed trains and mass transit today is people can use their devices and be connected for their entire travel journey. They don't need to pause and stop what has become a natural part of their everyday activity. We need to leverage the fact that that is available today through mass transportation and available today through high-speed rail. And we need to then focus on how do we make that experience in a mass transportation environment and in high-speed rail as close to a personal experience as possible. And if we get that right, and certain operators around the world are working on it, there was the example that Andy mentioned this morning about NTV. It's a big deal when you have a U.S. private equity firm go out and buy a private high-speed rail operator in Italy. That is not normal behavior. That has never happened before. To me, it's a clear sign that change is coming. We provided the high-speed trains to that operator, and I'll tell you, they run it more like a cruise ship than they run it like a train. The people that they hire out of the hotel and hospitality industry. The practices that they use are much more in line with best practices in the hospitality industry. We need to think about that as well if we're going to be successful, and it's a lesson we can learn from other operators around the world. The other thing operators are looking at is capacity. Back to the return on investment. If you've got a tube, and that's what a train is, that's about 200 meters long, or you can put two of them back to back and you have 400 meters long, how do you maximize the number of people in that train? It's a trade-off. Remember what I shared before about creating the private passenger experience in a public space? If you pack it too tightly, you lose that. One of the things we've been seeing from operators is they want smaller cars. I compare it to the 747, right? If you ever fly in the upper deck of a 747, it's a completely different experience than if you're in the bottom and you've got this huge tube with people all around you. One of the things rail operators are starting to look and do, and Amtrak actually did this with the trains that they bought, is buy shorter coaches. You can still fit close to the same number of people in the train, but it creates a very different experience when you have fewer people in the cab. And one of the things that we've seen, particularly in France, is when high speed is introduced in the right line and there's the right demand for it, single deck is never enough. Everybody wants to go to double deck because you need the capacity. And so, you'll see today, and California's even looking at this as well, how do they maximize and strike this balance between the maximum number of people in the train while maintaining the right level of comfort and amenity where it doesn't feel overcrowded. The other thing some operators are doing is getting back to maximizing the ROI is maybe they don't need to go very high speed. Maybe they can't go very high speed because they don't have the money. Can you use a tilting train to be able to have a much faster journey time than you have today at a slower speed on existing infrastructure? You can look at the key references on the right side in the gray box. You have operators all around the world that have elected to go this route. They recognize they just don't have the money to build new track. There's existing track that's in place. Let's get the most out of that we can with the technology available. Florida is a perfect example. They're not tilting, but they took an existing right-of-way with an existing freight line. They put a faster train on it, focused on the passenger experience. I used to live in Florida. I'm convinced they're going to have a very good, profitable operation. And as that starts to build momentum, where people start to see that, we'll see more success. So what have we learned as a company? And where are we focused when we look around the world? What we have done is we've actually played back and forth with two different architectures of high-speed trains. And there's really two architectures out there. One is what we call a conventional architecture. And the way to think about that is you have a rail car and you see two sets of wheels, one at each end, and you connect the rail cars with a link. But there's a gap and there's a space between those two trains. The other architecture is what we call an articulated architecture, where you actually set the bogie or the wheels underneath where the two trains come together. So the trains themselves now are a continuous rigid mass, and think of a platform on which the two trains are sitting on, the two cars are sitting on top of each other on this platform. French engineers, as French engineers will do, will over-design things. And initially when they started to introduce the first high-speed trains, were focused on how do we deal with safety. They were really concerned about jackknifing at high speed. And so they were like, if we put the two trains on top of a single bogie, that won't happen. And 40 years later, and you look at the history of what's happened, it's actually proven out. When trains derail, and bad things happen, trains derail, articulated trains stay together. They'll literally rip the entire track out and stay still in one continuous piece. The other thing, in addition to safety, that we realized is, and as we're looking forward, operators need flexibility. You'll run a train for 5, 7 years, maybe 10 years. You're going to realize that things have completely changed. I mean, look at your car, right? More and more people are leasing cars every 2 years because technology changes, because needs change. The idea today of buying a train and running that same train for 30 years, or running that train even for 15 years before you get to a complete overhaul, is obsolete. Things are changing too quickly. So the idea behind this articulated train set with power cars at either end, you have the engines that are going to run. They don't need to change. But then you have this continuous tube in the middle that you can add cars, you can remove cars, you can change cars, you can swap cars, you can update cars, you can modify configurations. It gives the operator a lot more flexibility. Talked about that a little bit. Little bit about Amtrak. So I get a little offended when I hear people say there's no high-speed rail in the U.S. Amtrak's still technically almost high-speed. Again, the reason the project happened was because of the business case. There is so much money to be made. There is such a need for the service that they got the funding to move forward. But the thing that's interesting, if you think about it, the U.S. and the world have finally come to a point of convergence that didn't exist before. So the current Acela train was built to what's called a Tier 2 standard. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the world except for the United States. They basically wanted a tank on wheels that could run at fairly high speeds. But Amtrak suffered because of it. They're now faced with having a train that is completely unique in the world. Parts are becoming obsolete. Technology is obsolete. It's more expensive for them to operate it. So US DOT and the Federal Railway Administration had the wisdom that they said, hey, look, the US is building momentum going towards high speed. Amtrak's looking at buying, California's looking at buying, maybe Texas, maybe Las Vegas, maybe the Midwest. We need to do something about it. So the regulations in the US have been modified to allow and enable what is called a Tier 3 train, which is a fairly global standard. And this train is the first Tier 3 train that is going to run in the United States. That in itself, forget about the fact that Amtrak's infrastructure is not going to allow it to go 186 miles per hour. What has in fact happening, what is happening right now is the first true high-speed train from overseas is going to be coming to the US and be able to run on the Northeast Corridor. And if it can run on the Northeast Corridor and we can bring Tier 3 trains into the US, California is going to be easy from a technical standpoint. The tough part's still going to be the politics. The tough part is still going to be the business case, but the technology is there and we're doing it and it's really good news. So again, it's all about serving passengers. You know, stop talking about how fast trains go. Stop talking about technical performance. Think, are the services that are being offered and being presented profitable? Think, are they serving passengers the way that passengers want to be served? And if the answer to both those questions are yes, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. Let's continue to stay the fight. We're going to continue to stay supported to U.S. high-speed rail because it's a good fight they have, and we will see high speed in California and in other places around the U.S. Thank you for your time.